First of all, thank everyone for coming. I'm going to first turn things over to Joseph. Are you there, Joseph? Yeah, okay. Joseph, you're on mute.
So do I start now, Lucas? Okay, all right. So I want to start by saying something about the status of Market Lonergan project following the passing of Father Bob on January 21, 2021. I'm saying this because there has been so many questions about what happens to Market Lonergan project, and I think it would be a good thing for me to start by making sure we know where we are at.
I think we lost Joseph. Joseph's in Nigeria right now, so the internet's a bit shoddy. As we wait for Joseph to get back on, maybe Danielle, I'll turn it over to you next, because I also know you wanted to welcome people. Yep.
Certainly, thank you, Luke. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Marquette's Department of Theology. We are very grateful to Joseph Ogbonnaya, to Luke Briola, our presenters, and all those who have made this event possible, including those who support the Marquette Lonergan Project, the International Institute for Method in Theology, and Marquette's Center for the Advancement of the Humanities. As Joseph mentioned a moment ago, we know that we owe the existence of these spring colloquia within the context of the Marquette Lonergan Project to our beloved friend and colleague, Father Robert Doran, S.J., who passed away on January 21st of this year. When this colloquium was postponed last year due to COVID, Father Doran was ever forward-looking, trusting that we would be coming together in this way, and here we are. In the fall, he was anticipating our gathering with abundant joy and excitement. We therefore take this opportunity to remember Father Doran, to celebrate his life and legacy, and to be thankful for all the ways in which he continues to inspire us to live out our calling as ones who care for our common home. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And thanks for the support of the Marquette Theology Department, which you chair with this colloquium, and for your alacrity in kind of adjusting to a Zoom format. So thank you, Danielle. We have Joseph back now. We'll give him another chance. Joseph. Okay, I think Joseph is gone again. That's okay. We've made contingency plans in case that happens. So again, I'd like to thank Danielle. I'd like to thank Joseph Ogbonnaya for his support as he's kind of taken over the reins here. They've been incredibly helpful in setting up this colloquium and garnering interest. And also thank for the people who came. We have a very wide breadth of people here. We have representations from 4 different continents. I know Father Doran spoke often about his desire to, for the colloquium to reach, well, to be international. And he had talked about the possibilities that virtual tools how this could assist in this goal. And certainly we've kind of realized that, at least accidentally, by moving this colloquium online. I'd also like to thank Heidi Bostic, who was here just a second ago. Yeah, she's still here, for her support. She's Dean of the Arts and Sciences at Marquette. I'd like to thank, we have some representation from St. Vincent here, including my college president, Father Paul Taylor, OSB. I'd like to thank the students, the undergraduate students who have come for some of their classes with at Marquette. And finally, as I'd like to echo what Danielle said, I'd like to thank Father Robert Dorn for all his help in adjusting this, in assisting me with this 2-year preparation for this colloquium. We spent the last 2 years going back and forth about this. We've rescheduled it, we adjusted it in light of the pandemic. And then, as many of you know, and as Danielle just mentioned, Father Dorn tragically passed away on January 21st of this year. Of course, it was Father Dorn who initially formed this institute. It was personally Father Dorn who very much helped me find my own voice and encourage the workings of this particular group, the Ecological Culture group, for which we'll hear today and tomorrow. It was clear that he had hoped this gathering would proceed even without him. On this point, I would like to begin the evening by officially launching the first 2 books put forth by the Institute, both published by Marquette University Press. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can people see that? Okay, good. So the first is, as many of you are familiar with and many of you have contributed to, is a book that Joseph and I edited together, entitled Everything is Interconnected Towards a Globalization with a Human Face and an Integral Ecology, which doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but this book represents the joint collaboration of the Ecological Culture group and the economics group of the Institute. Show you the, Father Dorn wrote the foreword for this book. The first half of the book are essays that deal with globalization and economics, and a selection of excellent articles, and matched by a selection of excellent articles in the Integral Ecology section. And many of these papers will be hearing, or people will be hearing today. So Father Tom Hewson, Ben Homan, Christina, and Edward, and Tom McCauley will all be speaking at this colloquium. That book was published in 2019. So originally that was supposed to be launched last year before the pandemic changed our lives. The second book is soon forthcoming. Joseph, are you in?
Yes,
Oh.
I'm in now.
Okay, here, okay.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I just want to say that I have been off and on. That's one of the intricacies of developed parts of the world. You try everything, and then things are not as strong as they are in Europe and North America. All right, so the second book is titled Intellect, Affect, and God. They are essays that honor Father Bob. And these essays, they concentrate on various aspects of Father Bob's interdisciplinary scholarship in the areas of integral ecology, philosophy, politics, culture, critical hermeneutics, systematics, pastoral theology, and economics for humane globalization. This book is 22 chapters, and it has contributions from all the 5 subsections of the International Institute for Methodology. It is out already from Marquette University Press, we will be able to access it. And by next month, copies in Amazon and so many other book centers. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Joseph. Joseph, do you want me to share the table of contents?
Yes, please.
Okay. These are the table of contents. So there's several sections, one on integral ecology, one on philosophy, critical hermeneutics, economics and globalization, systematic theology, which represent the 5 sections of the Institute, and then a 6th section that discusses the ongoing reception of Father Dorn's work, with a particular emphasis on various cultural contexts. Okay. Just a final word, a quick word on the schedule. Okay. So I've organized this colloquium with panels. We have 3 panels really. Tonight, Cristina will speak, and then I'll give a very, very brief response just to get the conversation going. And then tomorrow we have 2 panels. Each of the panels, each of the talks will be approximately 30 minutes long. And then that'll give us about 30 minutes to have conversation afterwards. And that's been always one of the features of the colloquia is that we can have very strong and robust conversation about the papers, that this is really a collaborative venture of learning and from each other and helping, of establishing a collective insight. I acknowledge that Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. So if you need to leave or come and go at any time, feel free to. If you want to black out your screen for a little bit and eat dinner or whatever, that's quite fine with me. We have a final section here tomorrow from 2 to 2:30. Where do we go from here? And that is a 30 minutes reserved for talking about as a group within the Institute, so as the Ecological Culture group, future projects we might be interested in or ideas people might have. That's open to anyone who's interested in it. There's absolutely no pressure to join that. So really the colloquium ends at 2, and then we'll have some conversation afterwards with people who are interested in that. Our first speaker tonight is Cristina Vanin. Cristina is an associate professor of theology, an associate dean, and director of the Master of Catholic Thought, theology program at St. Jerome's University in Waterloo, Ontario. She received her bachelor's from St. Jerome's University, her MDiv from St. Michael's College in Toronto, and her PhD in theology from Boston College. She has worked with the Jesuits of Canada on its Mission and Ecology Committee and has helped to prepare a guidebook on Laudato Si for the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Influenced by the thought of Bernard Lonergan and Thomas Berry, her work focuses on the role that theology can have in helping us respond adequately to the ecological crisis. Recent publications include Ecological Conversion, What Does It Mean in Theological Studies? This was with Neil Ormrod. Many of you are familiar with that article. And for Joseph and I's volume, Ecological Conversion, Healing and the Integral Ecology of Laudato Si. Tonight, she will be speaking on the topic, Ecological Conversion after Laudato Si. So thank you, Cristina. I'll turn it over to you. I think you had a PowerPoint you'd like to share. You should have sharing privileges.
All right, we're good. Okay, so we'll do one little step at a time, right, on this. I haven't, I participated in webinars, but I haven't presented, so this might be a little bit rough, but we'll go. And I will share my screen in a minute, but maybe what I'd like to start with, it's been at a couple of conferences, webinars that I've attended. I'd like to start with acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And my university is situated on what's known as the Haldeman Tract, and it's they're 10 kilometers on two sides of the Grand River. So I have been in conferences where people have invited, if you'd like to, in the chat, just put the traditional lands where you're currently situated, and so that we're acknowledging all of those. And maybe I'll just let that be for a minute. Or I can give you time to go look it up and find out. There we go. Thank you. Here they come. Lovely. All right. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for being here. Good to see some faces that people that I do know, and I am sorry that we're not actually at Marquette, but this really is quite wonderful that we actually can gather today. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. And now we'll try this share the screen thing and see how it goes. So you need to tell me how that works for you. I'll put it on full slideshow. I think what I know is that when you put it on full slideshow mode, I lose seeing everybody. So let's try and see what happens with that. Oh, there we go. And maybe Luke, you're going to have to manage chat things, like if people are having any kinds of troubles with things.
Right, absolutely.
Okay. Because I was doing a test run for a public lecture we're having at St. Jerome's next week, and there were a lot of little glitches to check through. So, you know, and I'm glad you let everybody do what you need to do. I thought a PowerPoint would be helpful. That way, if you don't need to be looking at me or looking at a gallery of faces, which is what I'm doing most days, all days. So the general theme was ecological conversion after Laudato Si, and what I thought what I wanted to do in this paper is just bring together some of the things. Yeah, I'm assuming some of you have read the paper that Neil and I wrote. I'm not going through all of that. I just want to draw a little bit from that, where I'm sitting right now with my own questions. And this will bring in Lonergan's voice, Bob Doran's voice, but also some other voices that have influenced my own thinking. So in his encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis argues for the development of an ecological culture in which we understand ourselves as part of nature, included in nature, in constant interaction with nature. And he repeatedly in that encyclical reminds us that everything is interrelated and interdependent. However, such statements in and of themselves do not seem to move human persons and communities towards the ecological conversion that that document is about. Nor does the substantial data about things such as climate change or species loss or habitat degradation, none of that data seems to move human persons and communities either. So I'm interested in this paper, this presentation, on focusing on a couple of questions, and I look forward to the conversation. They continue to be, I was saying to Luke the other day when he and I were checking in, these have been my questions for a long time, and perhaps they will always be there with for my whole life, because ecological conversion isn't complete. And so I just keep asking, how are we to understand the resistance or the inability of persons and communities to acknowledge, accept, respond to the ongoing deterioration of the Earth's ecosystems? So how do we understand the resistance? And then what helps us to overcome resistance? And I'm going to focus today in particularly at the psychic level, so that we can move towards what Pope Francis calls an integral ecology. For me, when I read Laudato Si and have looked at it many, many times, I take this as the heart of this document. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? And I'm intentional about some of the images because Thomas Berry, who will come up in a little bit, always makes, oh.
We can't see the next slide you've put up.
Oh, that sucks.
Maybe go back to the original view, and we can just kind of watch to there.
Let's try that.
Oh, now we see it.
It's sort of alternating. Like we're on the slide editing view as opposed to the presenter view.
Okay.
Yeah.
How is that for everybody?
Yeah,
Is that better?
Yeah, that's good. We can see the second slide now. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the kind of stuff I have not yet figured out how you do PowerPoint and the way you want to do PowerPoint when you're on these calls. Thank you. All right, so for me, this is the question that I think is at the heart of this document. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? And I think of children not just as human children, and that's been the influence of Thomas Berry on my thinking. Pope Francis challenges us with the statement, "This sister of ours, the earth, our common home, now cries out to us because of the harm that we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her." And Francis suggests that we maltreat the earth because we have forgotten who we really are. As he says that we are dust of the earth, that the elements of our bodies are the elements of the earth and the stars, that we breathe the air of the earth, that we receive life and refreshment from the waters of the earth. And so he goes on to say at the beginning of the encyclical, the earth is lamenting. And today, the groans of the earth join the groans of all human persons who are forsaken. There we go. So many of these problems, Pope Francis says, stem from the centrality and the pervasiveness of what he calls sometimes the technocratic paradigm, the technological paradigm. And he points out that this paradigm shapes every single aspect of our lives. In terms of how central the market is to that, he also raises and refers to some of Pope Benedict's writing, who Benedict himself says, by itself, the market cannot generate the kind of integral human development and social inclusion that Pope Francis is wanting to talk about. So what we need, and what the encyclical suggests, is a new cultural paradigm. And at the core of that is what Pope Francis calls an integral ecology. And so I think of that as it's a new way of thinking and acting. It leads to new policies, a new sense of education, new lifestyle, new spirituality. And the hope here is that this new culture can help us as human beings resist this dominant technocratic paradigm. I think one of the problems for us is that this paradigm is so pervasive and it's so extensive that it's difficult for us as human beings to imagine a different way of understanding the world. Furthermore, the mindset is so dominant that it really is difficult for us to operate without all the benefits and the resources of this particular paradigm. And so when we as human beings utilize the resources, we find ourselves kind of pulled into the logic that governs the use of them. I hear that myself in presentations, classrooms, and so on, right? How else could we, like, what other option is there, right? This is the paradigm that guides us. Let's just do some tweaks or some adjustments to the current paradigm. Let's make sure it works better for more people. Let's sure the environment is taken care of. Let me keep unpacking a little bit more of the problem side of things. In a similar way to Laudato Si, cultural historian Thomas Berry warns that while there's a lot of good that's being done in education, economics, agriculture, global governance, religions, there's still a serious difficulty pervading our planet, because all of these good efforts do not seem to be enough. We continue to devastate the earth in so many ways. Loss of biodiversity, whether you're talking about species or cultures, pollution, waste, deforestation, climate change, you know the list. Barry says that one reason for this is, and this is where the sense of alienation in the title of my presentation, one reason for this is our human alienation from the natural world is so extensive that we're not even aware of it. He describes it this way. While we have more scientific knowledge of the universe than any people ever had, it's not the type of knowledge that leads to an intimate presence within a meaningful universe. Our world of human meaning is no longer coordinated with the meaning of our surroundings. And as I've put here from this quotation, our children no longer learn how to read the great book of nature from their own direct experience. They seldom learn where their water comes from or where it goes. We no longer coordinate our human celebrations with the great liturgy of the heavens. We no longer hear the voices of the rivers, the mountains, the sea. The world about us has become an it rather than a thou. End of quote. Even the idea that we should have an integral and intimate relationship with the natural world lies so far outside our horizons that we cannot contemplate it. And so Barry would say, as a consequence of this deep-rooted alienation, we live out our daily lives in a world of objects rather than subjects. For many of us, we have little contact with the natural world. For many of us, we simply regard it as a backdrop to our human undertakings. And so the natural world has little connection for us about what is meaningful in life. Another writer, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Richard Louv, he has this wonderful book called Lost Child in the Woods. And in this book, he's providing a perspective here on, another perspective, I think, on our alienation from the natural world. And what he discusses there is what he refers to, what's being developed as nature deficit disorder that human children are experiencing. And so one thing that he says in this text is, what happens when all the parts of our childhood are soldered down? When the young no longer have the time or the space to play in their family's garden, or cycle home in the dark with the stars and the moon illuminating their routine, or walk down through the woods to a river, lie on their backs on hot July's days in long grass, watch cockleburs lit by morning sun like bumblebees quivering on harp wires. what then? Will our human children experience what Bill McKibben calls the end of nature? Thomas Berry also laments what has happened to our human children. And he says, for children to live only in contact with concrete and steel and wires and wheels, machines, computers, plastics, for them to seldom experience any primordial reality or even to see the stars at night, that is a soul deprivation that diminishes the deepest of their human experiences. So Berry argues that as a consequence of this deep alienation from the natural world, we human beings, through all of our institutions, end up teaching our human children about an economic system that depends on the exploitation of life systems. So if we want our children to have an attitude of exploitation, if we want them to think that the resources of the planet are simply there for our human use, then all we need to do is what we're doing. That is, make sure that our children lose any feeling, affectivity, connection with the natural world, any relationship with it. And it seems to me that's not difficult for this to happen because those of us that are educating those children ourselves lack sensitivity for the planet, to the degree that we may not even be aware of the need to have an intimate relationship with the whole of the natural world. And then Pope Francis too, I think in Laudato Si speaks about our human alienation from each other and from the natural world. He will often identify the excessively anthropocentric nature of our current culture and the way in which that excessive anthropocentrism compromises the sense of dignity of the natural world. So for him, this distorted anthropocentrism is an indication of what he talked about at the beginning of the encyclical, namely that we human beings don't understand who we truly are. And because we don't know who we truly are, we actually end up working against ourselves and certainly against the planet. So he takes aim against this paradigm in which technology comes to be seen as the principal key to all of human existence. He critiques our unthinking reliance on market forces that embrace every technological, scientific, or industrial advancement before considering how those technologies will affect the environment and without any consideration for how they will affect human beings. He quotes Romano Guardini and Guardini's book, The End of the Modern World, more than once in the document. And so here I have one of those quotations. And Guardini says, the technological mind sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as a mere given, as an object of utility, as raw material to be hammered into useful shape. It views the cosmos as a mere space into which objects can be thrown with complete indifference. So lots of voices that all of whom are talking about human beings and their alienation from the natural world and the paradigm or the mindset from which human beings live and operate in the world. So I want to turn now to some of Bob Doran's work, first on the dialectical culture, just to start to unpack a bit of a framework that to help us understand or think about this ecological alienation a little bit further. So I'm not going to go extensively into here. We have various familiarities with I just want to raise some of this and maybe we can talk about it more. So Doran offers to us the analogy of the dialectic and the integral scale of values as primary categories for understanding the structure of history. So each dialectic is internally constituted as an unfolding of linked but opposed principles of change. And so there's a dialectic of the subject, there's a dialectic of community, and Bob Doran speaks extensively about the dialectic of culture. So when we get to a dialectical culture, then the principles of change are, on the one hand, cosmological, constitutive meaning, and what he calls anthropological constitutive meaning. So let's hold that. And then the other, right? So we have the analogy of the dialectic and then the integral scale of values for understanding the structure of history. So again, I'm not going extensively into this, but recall that Lonergan talks about 5 levels of value: vital, social, cultural, personal, and religious. And among many things that he discusses are the ways in which higher levels of value condition the schemes of recurrence at other more basic levels. So if you go from top down, religious values condition the possibility of personal integrity. Personal integrity, self-transcendence, authenticity conditions the possibility of developing genuine cultural values. Cultural integrity conditions the possibility of us having and establishing and sustaining a just social order. And a just social order conditions the possibility of the equitable distribution of vital goods. So in all of this discussion, we get a sense of a society is healthy to the extent that that dialectic of a community is healthy, right? To the extent that there's a good, healthy dialectical tension between the 2 principles of change in the dialectic community, namely spontaneous intersubjectivity on the one hand and practical intelligence on the other. And because the higher level conditions the possibilities at a lower level, then we're going to look, right, the dialectic, if you want a healthy dialectic of a community, you're pushed to look at a dialectic of culture, because it's genuine cultural values that can ensure the integrity of the dialectic of community. And Doran really, helps us to think, right, about the dialectic of community in a global sense. I'll just leave that there. We can talk about that because we really are living now in a global interdependent order. So we're going to need to generate cultural values that are more complex and that are adequate to speaking to a global interdependent order. So that's where attention to this need for genuine cultural values pushes us to consider the dialectic of culture. So drawing on Eric Volkland, Doran argues that, as with the other dialectics, the dialectic of culture is a dialectic of contraries. Cosmological constitutive meaning is the limiting factor, and anthropological constitutive meaning is the promoter of transcendence. So in a healthy dialectic, both poles are to be affirmed, and like the other dialectics, the integrity of the dialectic of culture is a function of the concrete unfolding of the insights and meanings of both poles. So what do we have here? With the cosmological pole, meanings and values are drawn from the natural rhythms of the cosmos and the cycles of nature. So the cosmic order is reflected in the order of society within which myself as an individual finds my place. And, I think we can still see some vestiges of cosmological meanings and values. I think operating to a greater extent within indigenous peoples. Maybe just some vestiges of it, because I think we have lost quite serious sight of it, of cosmological culture operative for us in the Northern Hemisphere, in our Christian celebrations of Easter that take place intentionally in the spring, and celebration of Christmas at the time of the winter solstice. On the other side of the dialectic, the anthropological pole draws meanings and values from reason, a source of reason that transcends the world. So insight moves from God through the individual to society. And so in this pole of the dialectic, as individuals, we conform ourselves to transcendence, the self-transcendence of reasoning, and societies, in broader terms, conform themselves to the reasoning of rational individuals. So as with any of the dialectics, there can be a distortion. And the distortion of the dialectic of culture involves, in Doran's words, anthropological consciousness losing affective sympathy with nature as it constitutes history on the one hand, or on the other hand, cosmological consciousness succumbing massively to what he calls a fatalism that it supposes is inscribed in cosmic rhythms. So in our article, Anil and I talked about this is what we see, that we're finding ourselves today in a distorted dialectical culture, in which the anthropological culture dominates to the point that cosmological meanings and values are not simply neglected, but ridiculed. And I think in Laudato Si and Pope Francis's minds, the roots of this kind of cultural crisis are extremely deep. And the deeper the roots of the crisis in us as individual human beings, then the more difficult it is to really reshape, right? Habits, ideas, behaviors that have become very comfortable and very ingrained. So let me turn then to Bob Doran's notion of psychic conversion to help to unpack a little bit, maybe at least one dimension of these very strong, deep, resistant roots to conversion. All right. So when he talks about psychic conversion, Bob Doran notes that we're conscious in two ways. One is a major focus in Lonergan's work, and the other is what Doran is, in my understanding, is contributing. So the other way is being conscious has to do with this, what he calls the sensitive stream of consciousness itself, right? So the sensations, the memories, the images, all of what accompanies our experiencing, understanding, deliberating, and deciding. So what Bob talks about is the affective dimension of our asking and answering questions about our experience, the affective dimension of when we experience that satisfaction in having our questions answered. So there is both an intellectual aspect to that, but also an affective dimension. The problem can arise that we lose touch with that psychic flow, what he refers to, like it's a lovely phrase, the pulsing flow of life and the movement of life. So we can lose touch with it. Also, there can be obstacles to performing the intentional operations from some awareness of the sensitive stream of consciousness. We can be hampered by a censorship of the images, right, that we need in order to be able to answer our questions. We might experience internal resistance to even asking relevant questions. And again, that resistance can arise from desires, fears, joys, sensations, images, but also, right, from individual, group, and general biases that need to be overcome with moral and intellectual conversion. So psychic conversion has to do with establishing, reestablishing the connections between these two ways of being conscious. A connection that, from Bob's perspective, is easily lost and can be difficult to recover. And so he says in an article, the reason for reestablishing this connection in terms of authenticity is that affective self-transcendence is frequently required if we're going to be self-transcendent in the intellectual, moral, and religious dimensions of our living. All right. So on the psychic level of the ecological crisis, connecting then back to some of the earlier things I said, we're alienated from the rhythms and flows of the natural world. We've lost the connections between these rhythms and flows and how we as human beings operate in the intellectual, moral, and religious realms. And it seems to me that one of the ways that we can see this alienation from the natural world is in the types of images, those very mechanistic images that we have been working out of with regards to the natural world that are so much a part of the Western psyche. So at the level of psychic conversion, what ecological conversion is about is the movement from the ongoing process over time of moving from deep alienation to a deepening relationship with the natural world with its rhythms, with the other beings with whom we share this planet. Not to mention for me, with also the beauty, the awe, the immenseness of the story of an unfolding 13.4 billion year old universe. I think the psychic dimension of ecological conversion is about recognizing the impact upon our own psyches of the mechanistic images that we have are so ingrained in the West, and which in turn, those images affect how we relate to the natural world. They affect the extent to which we regard the natural world as a machine, as a diversity of parts. We can just use those parts as we see fit, etc. I think this psychic dimension of ecological conversion shows up in Laudato Si, when Pope Francis says that the goal of this document is not about amassing more information. Rather, he says, and this to me, I contemplate this in paragraph 19 many, many times. It's not about amassing information. His hope is that the encyclical helps every human being to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening into the world into our own suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. Or again, this is he brings from Evangelii Gaudium back into Laudato Si, the second sentence. God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we can feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement. So from my perspective, it's psychic conversion, that dimension of ecological conversion, that's going to help us to develop the depth of intimacy that's being talked about in these two quotations. And I think that's the depth of intimacy and the kind of conversion that we need if we're really going to respond to the sufferings of the earth and human beings that are part of the earth community as our own suffering, and then figure out what we're going to do. So something that I continue to explore is like, we can say that the psychic dimension is about developing that intimacy. It's an ongoing question about how do we encourage, move, what sets the conditions for developing that kind of intimacy. So one of the places I find a tremendous amount of help with that myself is by a lot of nature writers. I just finished reading a wonderful book called Ice Walker, but just helping me, spending a year, someone spent a year, more than a year, but I spent time going through the life of polar bears in northern Canada for a year through this writing. So, and part of the reason that I turn to contemporary nature writers is because my ongoing concern about what are we paying attention to, right? So what do we disregard? What do we pay attention to? And so there's a lot of in nature writers and people writing about nature writers about how they really are attending to the natural world. And so they can help my own capacity for that. So this is a quote from Madeleine Bunting, who wrote an article a while ago, 2007, about contemporary nature writing. And she said that there's been a shift from her, in her judgment, that now the point of contemporary nature writing is to help us understand that nature is no longer something to be studied from some kind of position of so-called scientific detachment, but rather that it's an experience, a relationship in which human beings are as much part of nature as anything that we might call wildlife. And so she says we need the kind of attentiveness to nature in order to understand our own humanity, of how we fit as a species into the broader community. Here's Thomas Lowell Fleischer, great, he edited a book called The Way of Natural History. And he too, another writer saying something different. So he talks about the like natural history, and what is it? It's a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world. And he argues in his essay, attention is a prerequisite to intimacy. So natural history is a means of becoming intimate with the world. And he goes on from here to argue, in this quote that I brought up here, that attentiveness to nature matters. Why? Because in a fundamental sense, we are what we pay attention to. Our attention is precious, and what we choose to focus it on has enormous consequences. What we choose to look at, to listen to, those choices change the world. Another writer, Leanda Lynn Haupt, wrote this. She's written a number of books on different species of birds, and she wrote one called Crow Planet, subtitled Essential Wisdom for Urban Wilderness. I really like her text because she also talks about this need for attentiveness to the natural world. Her focus is on what does that kind of attentiveness mean for many of us who live in urban contexts. Because we sometimes have a sense that the natural, nature is something out there somewhere, right? That's the problematic mechanistic image that we live from. So she reminds us in her text that those of us in urban contexts can connect to the natural world by the attention we're paying to our day-to-day lives. So walk your neighborhood paths, and COVID actually has helped a lot of people to do that and maybe begin to pay more attention. I'll just an aside. I mean, I found more urban forests in my own Waterloo region here. I didn't know, and I've lived here for over 25 years, and I found new urban forests that I didn't know about as a consequence of the pandemic. So she argues in her text that we have to overcome this disconnect that many human beings have between our daily living, the day-to-day stuff that I go through day to day, and what she refers to as wilderness. That's real nature, true nature, and what I live every day is something else. So in contrast, she says, no, absolutely not. It's actually in our everyday lives, in our everyday homes. That's where we eat. That's where we consume energy, run the faucet, compost, flush, learn, live. So it's here very much in our lives that we must come to know our essential connection to the earth, because this is where we shape the earth and will affect the earth. So this truth that we're connected to the natural world in and through our everyday lives is an invitation. She invites us in her text to start walking our neighborhoods and get to know all of our neighbors, human and other than human. As she says, on and off the concrete, above and below the soil. So this is about, again, for me, another person who just reinforcing this idea, an invitation to become deeply attentive to the places where we live and to all members of the community of life where we live, and to understand how we're connected to that community. So for Haupt, as it is for Barry, an intimate awareness of the continuity between our human lives and the rest of life is really the only thing that's going to truly help us to conserve this wonderful earth. I think I have this I brought this poem into the chapter for the book. It's a lovely poem from Walt Whitman, again, about the relationship between attentiveness and intimacy. There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became. And that object became part of him for that day, or a certain part of the day, or for many years, or stretching cycles of years. So I find this poem as an invitation to me to, what is it that I see? And how is that part of who I am? So Pope Francis in the encyclical suggests that we need to recover the sense of intimacy and so on. Where does he look in the encyclical? He says he holds up the life of St. Francis Assisi. And he says in the encyclical, St. Francis's response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or some kind of economic calculus. For St. Francis, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. And that is why St. Francis felt called to care for all that exists. So there's a lot in Laudato Si that with St. Francis, we too can take the time, right, to contemplate creation. Or as the encyclical says, to discover in each thing a teaching which God wishes to hand on to us. By paying attention to this manifestation of God in creation, we learn to see ourselves in relationship to all other creatures. So we can utilize our knowledge to open up to the insights that we're not aliens to this earth, that we're made of the same elements and part of the same family and share a DNA. We can come to feel these close bonds. So in Pope Francis's mind, it's when we come to feel those close bonds, or as he says here, intimately connected to all and united to all that exists, that's when we will care. And so it seems to me, just to circle back around, coming to recognize ourselves as part of nature and included in nature is something that I think we can come to know by this very deep, intentional attentiveness to creation. I think that kind of attentiveness can help to crack open, remove this psychic barrier between us as human beings and the rest of the natural world. So finally, it really is us as self-transcending human persons. It's us who commit ourselves to the process of conversion. And one of the things I think is striking, I don't always feel it myself, but Pope Francis is convinced that we're actually capable of undergoing this kind of transformation. And so, you know, he says all is not lost. Human beings, while they are capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing what is good, making a new start. But he does leave us with this interesting little question. Will that hope and promise last? In spite of everything, will everything authentic rise up in stubborn resistance to what is inauthentic? Thank you. Stop sharing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cristina. That was an excellent paper. And I love that question at the end. I've never really made that connection before, especially that emphasis on authenticity. That's excellent. So now I'll give just a very brief response. I should also add that if you have, so after my very brief response, we'll have questions. If you have questions, you can, as always, you probably know by now, you can raise your hand on Zoom. I have not been able to figure that out yet myself, but I know a lot of people have. You could type a question in the chat, or what I do is I just type the word question in the chat, and that usually gets people. So if you want to start to prepare those, that's quite fine. So again, thanks, Cristina, for your excellent and very clear presentation and really call for action. In it, Cristina has built upon what has been a consistent career trajectory of reflecting on the notion of ecological conversion from a Lonerganian perspective. A term first coined by Pope John Paul II in the early 2000s, ecological conversion signifies the fundamental continuity of Pope Francis's calls in Laudato Si with the environmental concern of his papal predecessors. Meanwhile, that more novel term, integral ecology, might signify some of the development that Francis is pushing for in Laudato Si in regards to the tradition. I was especially struck whenever I heard Cristina's talk here by several phrases, and I'll just read those out loud. I wrote them down. Alienation, mechanistic imaging of the world, of the natural world, the need for a painful awareness, a need for a certain depth of intimacy, the focus on attention, coming from a Benedictine institution like St. Vincent College, that focus on, that emphasis on listening in constellation with themes of stability and humility strike me as very, very important. What also strikes me in particular about Christina's work on this topic is the way that it flows naturally into a call for a renewed spirituality, more attentive to our connectedness to the earth, to our common home, and to our cosmic story. Her indebtedness to Thomas Berry is very clear on this point. The framework that Cristina has offered us here allows her to offer an environmental ethic that truly does operate on the third, maybe fourth stage of meaning. To start our conversation, though certainly not to limit it to these points, I thought that I'd offer up two questions. And the two questions I have here correlate with the two panels tomorrow. The first concerns the use of, and this will correlate with the first panel tomorrow morning, concerns the use of special and general categories. In Method and Theology, under the functional specialty of foundation, Lonergan writes that theological categories are either general or special. General categories regard objects that come within the purview of other disciplines, as well as theology. Special categories regard the objects proper to theology, end quote. General categories emerge through reflection on the transcultural elements of human intentionality. In developing the dialectic of limitation transcendence, of expanding on Lonergan's work on that point and in their personal, social, and cultural forms, Robert Doran offers us some further reflection on these general categories. Meanwhile, special categories are derived from revelation, even if general categories can help us make more sense of them. In his recent work on Lonergan's Trinitarian theology and soteriology, Doran has expanded our understanding of these special categories. In reading Ecological Conversion through themes like limitation and transcendence, anthropological and cosmological meaning, and psychic conversion, Vanin's reflections on ecological conversion primarily employs general categories. And this is very helpful and very important to read ecological conversion through these categories. General categories can yield broad appeal and understanding, and can help us, say, engage the poetry of Walt Whitman. I love that turn both here and in the book, and with other contemporary nature writers. Someone, again, from my Benedictine roots, but Kathleen Norris's book, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, is also, I think, very much speaks to the type of spirituality that Cristina is calling for. My question is how might special categories, especially from the Christian Catholic tradition, what role might they play in capturing the essence of ecological conversion as well? Is there anything specifically Christian about ecological conversion? And that's not a leading question. That's a genuine curiosity. How might Christology inform ecological conversion, or grace, or the Trinity, or the sacraments? After all, Doran also insists that the balancing of cosmological and anthropological meaning depends on a soteriological culture, that the integrity of the scale of values rests on God's triune offer of grace. Vanin's turn to St. Francis, Christina's turn to St. Francis of Assisi, hailed by Laudato Si as an example par excellence of an integral ecology, promises much in this regard, and she only mentioned this a bit, and I think she could say a lot, or she has a lot more to say on this just from my reading of her. In his magisterial biography of the saint, Lawrence Cunningham notes that St. Francis's nature mysticism cannot be separated from his radical following of the gospel. I'll be interested to think about how the papers tomorrow might develop this point. While the focus on general categories can help us more effectively appeal to a non-Christian audience, the use of special categories can help Christians better grasp, to use John Paul II and Francis's words, how care for creation is an essential part of our faith and not an optional add-on for Christian discipleship. All right, so the context for this question. I think the need for the work on this question is real. During the recent Vatican Synod on the Amazon, former head of the CDF, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, said in an interview that, quote, "We must absolutely reject expressions such as ecological conversion. There is only one conversion to the Lord, and therefore there is the good of nature," end quote. That Laudato Si still needs to be received 6 years out is clear, and especially I would say on the parish level. Locating ecological conversion in special theological categories might do the pastoral service of showing the false dichotomy that from that quote I just read, the false dichotomy between ecological conversion and conversion to Christ for what it is. So my question is, how might we integrate a call for ecological conversion within Christian theological categories without sacrificing the very important value of the broad appeal of general categories? So that's the first question for us to think about. And again, I think the panel tomorrow morning will help us think about that question. My second question. In Insight, Lonergan writes about the additional insight needed for the application of a particular idea. So he writes, "For just as insight is a necessary intermediary between sets of measurements and the formulation of laws, so also it is needed in the reverse process that applies known laws to concrete situations," end quote. So there's an extra insight in applying the work we do. Lonergan brings this claim to bear on theology and method in his discussion of the functional specialty of communications. So the question is, how might our theological reflections tonight bear fruit in the concrete? How might they be applied? And Cristina begins to consider these concrete applications in discussing, for instance, Richard Louv's diagnosis of nature deficit disorder in younger generation. I imagine that this audience, and certainly myself, is especially interested in how Cristina's presentation of ecological conversion might be implemented in educational settings. At one point, Cristina mentioned, when she was talking about Richard Louv's work, that do we train students or train our children into being exploiters of nature rather than being co-participants, co-creators in our common home? After all, Pope Francis's introduction of ecological conversion, Laudato Si, is immediately preceded by a section on environmental education that's meant to curb the excesses of consumerism and individualism. As he writes, quote, "Environmental education should facilitate making the leap towards a transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. It needs educators capable of developing an ethics of ecology and helping people through effective pedagogy to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care," end quote. He also adds in Laudato Si that seminaries and houses of formation should reflect this goal. And obviously, I think that can be extended to Catholic universities quite easily. Likewise, in his 2018 Apostolic Constitution, Veritas Gaudium, which is on ecclesiastical universities and faculties, Pope Francis sets forth a vision of education in which he calls for, quote, "the establishment of new and qualified centers of research where, as I proposed in Laudato Si, scholars from different religious universities and from different scientific fields can interact with responsible freedom and mutual transparency," end quote. We very much think and hope that the International Institute for Method and Theology represents such a center. This same call presumably applies to Catholic higher education. So the question is, how might Catholic higher education in particular foster the type of ecological conversion that Cristina identifies in her paper tonight? I've thought a lot about this as I teach classes in environmental ethics at St. Vincent. What role might walks play? What role might outdoor education play? What role might majors in agriculture play? What's the role of technology in the classroom? Cristina serves as an academic vice president and dean at St. Jerome's, which positions her especially well to implement such calls. And we have several other people who are relatively high up in higher education in administration that too, I think, are very sensitive to these questions. So I wonder in what ways that maybe Cristina herself or others have implemented this vision of ecological conversion to the educational mission of her institution or your institution. Again, I'd like to thank Cristina for her wonderful and thought-provoking paper, and again, call to arms, and for all of her efforts in general for the Institute, despite her new administrative duties. Now I'll open it up for either Cristina or others to join in the conversation. So again, feel free to participate as you do on Zoom. Okay, so Randy Rosenberg has a question, Cristina, on nature riders.
Yep. Her name is Leanda. Oh, let me just type it for God's sake. That was just, I have to say, my encounter with this particular text was a total fluke. I was at Georgetown for 8 months at Woodstock on a sabbatical fellowship thing. And I was living with people who were on, they had a book club and said, do you want to come and join our book club? Sure, what the heck's something to do besides, when I didn't want to do my research, but, and this is the book that I couldn't believe what I was reading. So, there are lots of ways in which grace puts things in front of you. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Cristina. Steve has a question. We can always count on Steve to have an excellent question.
Thanks, Cristina, and thanks, Luke. That was really awesome, really great. So my question is, when we're leaving the technocratic paradigm and moving to this integral ecology, I think whenever there's a conversion that happens, there is something good that has to be let go of. That is, I think we can sometimes wrongly paint conversion as you're in the midst of something that's really horrible, and then you go to something that is really good. The issue is that in place A, the good that you're holding on to is actually not good in the context of everything overall, right? Or B is a better good, so you're moving to it. So anyway, my question is, what do we have to sacrifice from our current technocratic paradigm? What do we have to be willing to let go of? What goods, or at least things that seem to us goods, in order to move into this integral ecology?
Okay, so you tap the screen.
Yeah, so that's I mean, I'm thinking partially of, like medical advances, for instance, people saying like, well, we have to keep, doing everything we possibly can to advance medically. And some of that is going to require, using up all of the horseshoe crabs or whatever it happens to be. And, some of those are misguided, but those kinds of questions of what is it that we have to sacrifice, that we have to be willing to in order to embrace this new culture and new paradigm.
This doesn't have to be a question and answer, but I think that's it's a great question. It's hard to, I don't have kind of a list, right? I think we're going to have to figure out. I think that ecological conversion, and I didn't go into the soteriology, thank you. I mean, but you just can't do it all. But religious conversion, there's some really good language in there, right? Sacrifice is going to be a piece of the puzzle. But it is one of the most, I think it's a difficult thing. I sometimes have suspicions that's another part of our resistance, is on some level that, we are unwilling to face as human beings. especially those of us that have everything that we need and are, have the privileges and the comforts of the system, right? I'm okay. Like the pandemic, this has been a constant thing I've been reflecting on this year with the pandemic. It just, it's really easy for me to just continue to, like, I'm fine. I have everything I need. My vital needs are met. So it's the idea that I'm going to sacrifice, like, I don't know what I'm going to need to sacrifice. So I think this is where the education that Luke is pointing to, the development of the virtues, all of that, I think they seem little sometimes. And sometimes I mean, myself have had reactions like, why is Pope Francis talking about these small daily actions? But that's the truth of it. So I'm going to go back to what we started with parenting. It's like, those are the small daily actions that integrate to some degree in my children's life, although they're at an age right now, as I said earlier, where they kind of reject everything their parents taught them, and you hope to God they come back to it. But you instill these habits, and you help, at least as a parent, try to help them. This, to me, part of education. Why does it matter to turn the faucet off? You really don't have to have the faucet running while you're brushing your teeth and while you're washing, all that kind of stuff. And if it could open up the kind of educational thing maybe that Luke is getting us to think about. That's one of the things I think about as a teacher, and I think about as a parent. It's not just do something or don't do something, but can I help you understand why this is meaningful and valuable and important? So, let's have a conversation about how much toilet paper you think you need to use. And that, it can matter how I come at that as an educator, whether it's a parent educator, or teacher educator, or learning. Where does it come from? Everything. There's so many things on something like toilet paper or water. Where does that water come from? Where does it go? Do you know anything about really the impact of what you're doing by this a small action? So to me, it's and that's why, is that a sacrifice to not have the faucet going full blast while I'm brushing my teeth? It's a kind of sacrifice if you have to change it, but it might open the door if I can do, open up the conversation that Luke was pointing to say there might be a greater sacrifice that's going to be required of us in the West, as we, because then it pushes to not just my consumption today of water, but the consuming of water by dominant groups, white, for the most part, privileged, northern, wealthy groups. Does that make any sense, Steve? It's sort of so I don't have a ritual, but I can think of, you can get, like, there are sacrifices that are going to be pushed of us. And I also think maybe on a more radical level, revolutionary level, I mean, the human beings who are absolutely being profoundly affected by climate change are going to be pushing the rest of us and not letting us get away with our behavior, because it's having an impact. I'll stop there. Other people, I'm sure, have lots to contribute to that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cristina. We're at St. Vincent, we're always required to make a reference to St. Benedict and then a reference to Fred Rogers. And I was reminded Fred Rogers's line that to make the good attractive, and a lot of environmental education needs to do that. So we have several questions now. Joseph mentioned or several points of comments about thinking, and as you just said, Cristina, about this question in non-Western countries, and how conversion, ecological conversion, the cosmological, anthropological cultures, dialectical culture might look different in non-Western, non-first world countries. I don't know if you want to respond to that. We also have a question from Edward.
I don't think I have. I do think we have to think about. I hear what Joseph's saying, the different ways in which we evaluate. That's kind of connected to me in my head, at least to Steve's questions too. It's like, what are we bringing to bear as we are making these kinds of evaluations, these moral evaluations. That's why the moral aspect of ecological conversion is a big one.
Edward?
First, thank you so much for such a rich presentation. My question has to do with something you started talking about toward the end of your answer to Steve, so I wonder if you might elaborate on it a little bit. And that's the connection between ecological conversion and the preferential option for the poor, which is very much a theme for Francis himself. But I want to ask in particular because sometimes some political framings try to pit these against each other. And I'm thinking in particular about opposition to affordable housing in neighborhoods. Very often, the arguments put forth against affordable housing developments have to do with sometimes opponents quote nature writers. Sometimes they speak, oh, but what of the green space we're now losing or the additional traffic? I think that's an artificial division, but a trope that plays out in political conversations. So I wonder how you see that connection. Is preferential option for the poor a different sort of conversion that needs to go hand in hand, or do you see it as incorporated into ecological conversion itself?
Yeah, for me, this is why Francis has us thinking about the things I think we should be thinking about it. So for me, that's part of what's going on in this phrase integral ecology. So it's an integral ecological conversion. And I've read some commentators, right, that this is a little bit of a shift from his predecessors, right, who might have had a little bit more emphasis and distinctions between human ecology and creation, let's say. And Francis putting in front of us this sense of integral ecology, I'm total in agreement, because it is a I think he's right. You cannot be attending. He's right when he says, look, if you don't care about your sisters or brothers, you're not going to care about the earth, your common home. So I don't think it's a priority of one over the other. And yet we're going to have to, when you start talking about the political challenges, right? This will come up. The prioritizing, are we prioritizing human beings over the rest of creation, or over against the rest of creation, right? And I think that's where this, I wouldn't say I have it all thought through really carefully, but I think it's part of the process of ecological conversion to get us to this different cultural mindset paradigm that has implications. And I think this is one of the hard things in conversion, when you're still operating out of a paradigm. And we just are living, breathing a paradigm of separateness and alienation. While we're talking here in Laudato Si and so on, we talk about we are interconnected, we're interdependent, and we have even increasing scientific confirmation of that. We still are living out of a paradigm where we're separate from, right? So even the asking of the question reflects, in my mind, that paradigm of alienation. So I think we're maybe on the road, not quite sure where we are on the road, but we may be on the road to, how do we ask these questions? How do we ensure that human beings, especially those who are most marginalized, have their vital needs? So that's where I think that's where the work on the scale of, like in our paper where we talk about looking at the scale of values and understanding that if you want to make sure all human beings, let's stay with human beings, have the vital needs, their needs met, you have to attend to those by looking at the good of order and so on, right? Up the scale. So I think we have to think about that. So does it mean you don't ensure that there's affordable housing? Of course not. But can we ask, maybe we need to, how do we ask those questions, and how do we talk about that? This is happening outside Toronto right now. There's a whole political thing around some wetlands, although there's no development there of affordable housing. It's not for affordable housing by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still the question. It's like, does a wetland matter? I don't think we're even used to asking the question about how might a wetland matter for human beings, all human beings, as well as other species. Like I think we're just not used to thinking that way. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense when I say that?
Yeah, thanks. And I should add that maybe after each, one of the nice things about Colloquium was that conversation was a lot more, people can talk, kind of respond to questions. So if anyone has a response to Christina's answer there, you can chime in now. Otherwise, we'll move on to Brian's.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both very much. Oh, I don't know why I presume.
So
I jumped the gun. That was silly of me. I'm so excited to ask the question. Yeah, let the response go. That was my bad. Sorry, I'm tired.
I was so glad Brian showed up first because I knew he could take care of the small talk for me. But so Steve had one comment and then we'll move it over to Brian. Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of on what Cristina was talking about, or something she was talking about made me think. I'm wondering to what extent we really have a separation and alienation from nature. That is, almost all the friends I have talk about how much they love being in nature, how much it raises their spirits. A lot of them go to parks pretty regularly. I'm wondering if, I think we can deepen that, and we need to deepen that. And I'm not saying that we're totally great there, but there's work to be done there. But I'm wondering to what extent it's more the fact that affectivity for nature is so distant from, for instance, the construction, what would need to happen for the construction of a new parking lot somewhere. That is, the decisions that we're making daily have such an abstract and distant connection to the things that are seriously harming the environment, that our affection for nature can't make that leap, or intellectually we can't make that leap to say, gosh, if I love this plant in my backyard or whatever, and nature in general, somehow that means I have to, decide that I'm not going to buy or not going to live in any newer housing for the rest of my life or something like that. And those are just very distant sometimes. So I wonder if it's not just creating the affectivity, but then connecting it to what are the actual consequences of different decisions and actions.
And that's why this is a limited paper. And that's why, this is not a plug for going and reading the paper that Neil and I wrote. I think there's more for us to do, and I would like to push that further, but that's why one aspect of conversion is not enough, right? So that's why Lonergan, I think, has a very rich sense of conversion. And so when you talk about these different aspects of conversion, and how they have an impact on each other. So you're right, the affective by itself isn't going to get us where you need to go. That by itself, because people can have lots of feeling for an affectivity for the natural world that doesn't actually make an impact on their decision making, whether as individuals and certainly not as communities. So the conversion is more than that. It's more than just that. I just simply was highlighting a question that continues to just get to me, that we're just not moving, especially because there's such a the climate scientists are telling us, some of them would say the planet is heating up to such a degree right now that it doesn't matter what we do. So you can get fatalistic that way, which doesn't matter anymore because we've already are going to have such an impact over the next 50 to 100 years that it won't matter. So that's difficult. How do you? So that's, to me, that connects to some of the soteriological dimensions and what religious traditions like Christianity might be able to bring.
Yeah, Thanks, Christina. Yeah, Christina, I met, we Zoomed last week, and we joked about how you have to kind of bring in the circus, all these categories and things, and by the time you bring it all in, there's very little time to say anything else. So it's natural to be limited in what we can and can't say. So well, so Brian has a very burning question.
God, now I feel even worse because what Steve asked actually relates to my question. I'm sorry, I was teaching all day and I'm clearly far too burned out. Zoom fatigue is real. You're not wrong, Luke. My initial question was actually Randy's, so I appreciate him asking for the lit review thing because I'm ignorant of a lot of this stuff. But Luke, while you were talking, you said something that sparked me to write a full question, so I'm just going to read it. My question is sparked by Luke's open question about a religious, and more specifically Christian, or I would probably say Judeo-Christian, framing of ecological conversion. So this actually directly relates to something I asked Ben Homan a few years ago as well, which we were still trying to sort of figure out. I wonder if Bob's point about the navigation of specifically anagogic symbols, so those symbols associated with good and evil, in and through psychic conversion might be useful here. If psychic conversion is at least partially a freeing and transformation of the psychic sensor's ability to choose which symbols and images are allowed to arise and basically give rise to insights and pattern our intentional consciousness, then that seems related. So in TDH and Trinity and History, Bob basically says that one factor of, and here I'm just summarizing what I'm saying for time, one factor of psychic conversion is reframing which symbols we associate with good and evil in conformity with transcendent religious value. And it's interesting to me while you were talking, I wonder if part of the problem isn't that our symbolic associations with nature tend to somehow either fall towards neutral, just net, it's there, it's neutral, it doesn't play into the discussion of the good, or, and this is a problem with a lot of Catholic discourse especially, but it's prevalent in certain other Christian theological traditions, we frame nature as fallen or divorced from supernature in a way that I think is really problematic. If you go and read Genesis, I think it's 7 times creation is good, top to bottom. And that's repeated throughout the scriptures. I wonder what, it's so funny, like Christina, you bring up polar bears and I look at a polar bear and I'm like, oh, the polar bear is so cute. But I'm not sure that hits me on some deeply seated psychological level. And I feel like in some sense, I already am trying to be ecologically converted. I wonder what we can do to, especially within a Judeo-Christian context, create more resonance relative to those symbols that affirm that nature in and of itself is an objective good, because that transvaluation of value cuts through intentional consciousness down to the psyche, and that's a lot. That's a big question, so I apologize. I don't know how to ask any other kind, but yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
You could start, Luke, because he's reacting to your initial question. If you want to try, I'm still got some stuff moving around in my head.
Well, I'll start by just joking that, or expressing my shock that the Zoom call didn't just end, that we have our first scripture reference in a Lonergan conference. Yeah, wow, we made
Got you, Joe Gordon.
Yeah, I think that stuff at the end of theological, of TDH, of that, on the symbol and stuff, I've always had a very difficult time understanding what exactly is going on there. But I have thought, especially, and this is kind of what I'm interested in, but just liturgically, how, sacramentality, that God kind of becomes present to us in the material or through the material world and things like that. That seems to be very ripe area for maybe a way of thinking through theological categories on that way of reframing or as Cristina said about kind of re-narrating the world. So yeah, that might be one connection. It's a good question. I don't have a perfectly clear answer. Cristina?
So I'm a big pastoral liturgical. I am in the Catholic Christian tradition. When I go to Eucharist, I am not feeling connected to the natural world. Now, that may be because the liturgists aren't great at raising those symbols. But that's where I think, you know, when I think of the framework of the dialectical culture, that resonates for me when in terms of so we have this principle of sacramentality, absolutely, Luke, and I will champion and speak about that principle. But this is where, for me as an educator, it's to what degree are we actually experiencing that when we go to Eucharist? You know, the Easter Triduum is coming up. There are so many, you know, the Christian use of from fire to and light and water and oil but boy, oh boy, they are the chasm between, you know, the experience and even in the physical church buildings that I've been in, that I've been very intentional about connecting even their architecturally or whatever to the natural world. So I think we have lots of work. Can we go there? We absolutely, I think we can, but we have work to do for those symbols to be to become real mediators. Yeah. So this, whether it comes from, you know, what is the bread that we're breaking? I mean, this is now Friday night and I'm tired after a long week, but it's like a wafer just doesn't cut it. You know, if you want to open up rich symbol and begin to open up a way for people in their day to day and connecting the meal symbol of Eucharist to the rest of their lives, I think there's lots we can do.
So I'm so grateful. It probably speaks to a lacuna in my own religiosity. My mind did not even go to liturgy, and that is an absolutely fabulous answer that and I'm sure Joe Mudd's laughing at me. He usually is. I appreciate that so much. That's crazy illuminative relative to what I was asking. Thank you both very much.
Well, I guess we answered them, Cristina. I know the liturgical scholar Kevin Irwin often decries that our liturgies are too wordy, and we need to retrieve the primalness of the liturgy, especially from a Catholic. He's speaking from a Catholic context, but obviously it's ecumenical point. Well, Ben, I think Ben had a comment.
Yeah, although I'm tempted to throw something in on this just because it's fresh and the comment is older. But maybe I'll just say quickly on this. While we were talking about this sort of sacramentality or sacramental consciousness, sacramental beholding of nature, I was reminded that Phil Rossi edited a volume, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, on ecology and grace, following, I think, a CTS. And one of the articles in that was Timothy McGrath pushing back on this notion of sacramentality in nature, saying, you know, you have to be formed to receive the sacrament of nature. So it's not just that, like, you encounter nature and, oh, okay, now that I've had this encounter, I'm ready. And that the Eucharist is about getting, I mean, he doesn't use this language, but that the Eucharistic experience, you might say, is a way of being formed in anthropological value such that you can apprehend cosmological value properly, such that you're formed to receive that. This is, as I say, it's sort of off the cuff, and it wasn't really why I raised my hand or whatever, but I thought about that. And then I thought in conjunction with that, I spend a lot of time in Orthodox liturgies. My wife is Orthodox, and my favorite part of Orthodox liturgy is the Cherubic Hymn right before you go to, right before you transition sort of from what at least I'm used to calling the liturgy of the word to the liturgy of the Eucharist. And the words of that hymn are, "Let us now lay aside all earthly cares." You know, I think I spend so much time in the beginning of church worrying about this, that, and the other concrete concerns and my sinfulness or my bills or my conference paper or whatever, that it never is a wasted comment when I'm reminded, we'll take a second and lay aside the earthly cares and go to Eucharist and then come back and see how the world looks through that. So I don't know if that, I think, Brian, that that relates somewhat to what you're talking about, but I was going to say, on both Steve's comment and Luke's initial question, I'm sort of struck by how difficult it is, sort of in response to Mueller, how difficult it is to have an ecological conversion, which I think is a categorical conversion, worked out in relation to the four transcendental conversions. And I was sort of especially struck by.
Oh, so I guess for the scripture reference earlier.
That could not have been a worse possible timing. It was right as he was winding up.
Well, does anyone else have a follow-up to what Ben was about to say? I'll give him a minute where I know we're just about out of time, but I want to give him a chance to come back in the room. Any other responses? Yeah, Joe? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I'll vamp for Ben. So the question that Brian raised, I think, is really important for us all thinking about sacramentality, because we're coming along at a certain point in history, right? And for modern thinkers, nature has effectively become a symbol of evil, right? That's why it needs to be subjected to prediction and control. It's violent, it's dangerous, right? So look at Machiavelli, look at Bacon, look at Kant, right? Nature is a problem. So we've inherited that, right? The subjection of nature by human technology is to make us safe. Now there's an insight there, right? It is dangerous for us. If you spend any time outdoors, you know how dangerous it is. But once you magnify that into a cultural paradigm, then you're constantly trying to smash the thing. And in that context, you have no sacramental relationship to it. It can't be a mediator of the divine presence. It can only be demonic. And so there does need to be a fundamental shift in the symbolism of nature for us as modern people, as something that's not a threat to our existence, but that is the source of our existence. And until we do that, I think our discourses, and so I really appreciate, Cristina, your emphasis on psychic conversion. I think we can push it even harder.
Thanks, Joe. Well, we have Ben's back.
Yeah, sorry, I got booted. I'm kind of in the middle of stream of consciousness, but also I'll just try and wrap up what I wanted to say quickly, which is, it seems to me that some of the most fundamental insights of persons who are ecologically converted in some ways are so hard to are learned sort of through the body. I'm one generation removed from farmers, and it seems that, you know, what's the one thing that you have to give up in order to achieve certain ecological goals? Well, it seems like the answer is comfort. And I don't think I know anybody except for my farm family who has learned that lesson, where, you know, every farm story has two titles. So it's like why you don't climb over a barbed wire fence with a shotgun, or how Uncle Albert lost his fingers. And so it's like every story about farm life is about bodies on the line to make the farm work, and about comfort on the line to make that work. I went to a talk last week with Norman Wurzba talking about urban agrarianism. And I'm not knocking Wurzba at all. I really think there's a lot of good in his work, but I couldn't help but think that this is a sort of like voyeuristic farming or like vacation farming. It's not like, how do you still, tending a community garden, how do you still get that deep bodily insight into, no, it really is this on the line. It is comfort on the line at a deep level. And yet those same farm family are precisely the people who vote against the big. Anyway, so that was sort of the disconnect I was trying to get at. I'm sorry, it's sort of piecemeal. But.
What you're pointing to, and it may not be what you're trying to point to, Ben, but in my head, I was connecting to Ed's question earlier. You can think about, I mean, the food system is one place, one system to look at, and how that food system has evolved over time. So Joe, I think it reflects some of what you're pointing to, but it's just, it is a system that is unjust and problematic for human beings and for the soil, all those we've got. So it's really that's where you can start with anything. At my university, I mean, Luke was telling me the educational piece is sort of we take our students on a service learning experience and travel to Peru, and the focus is coffee. And because lots of people will have their cup of coffee. And where I live and where I'm privileged to live, I can afford to spend $4 on a cup of coffee if I drink coffee. So we find ourselves on meeting small scale women, coffee growers who are part of a cooperative. And in that encounter, because it's very much for us, Francis's invitation to develop a culture of encounter as opposed to the indifference and the throwaway culture. So how do you encounter? And encountering real people who are affected by a market, a certain economic system and way of doing farming, that's how you start to open it up, right? From what I consume, one thing that I consume, you can start to invite people as they can to understand the impact of my purchasing of a cup of coffee in downtown Kitchener. And how is that connected to this global interdependent system? And who does that global interdependent system serve? And who does it not serve? And so that's where the education piece is absolutely important. It's connected to the day-to-day. So that's where that's why I like Hopped. It's like, it is where I live. It is what I consume. It is what I throw away. All of those pieces. And I agree with you, Joe. Like, we have just inherited. Thomas Berry has much to say about the mindset that we've inherited, and that our Christianity has not been protected from that mechanism, right, by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, we have this sense of nature is something that we must be saved from, and we must. So he will have things to say about our Christology, things to say about our sense of eschatology. That it's all about get away from this planet that can kill you, or right, with Francis Bacon, control it as much as you can.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Well, we're out of time. Thanks again, Christina, for your excellent paper, and thanks to everyone for the excellent kind of questions and conversation. That was, I felt like we did kind of reach some collective insight there. So that's the hope for this institute. So thank you, everyone. Tomorrow we have a panel in the morning from 10 to 11:30 a.m. That is Central Time, Eastern Time, 11 to 12:30. I keep saying this about the time schedules. I'm so paranoid about it myself. I'm projecting that onto you. In fact, I almost had the wrong time before Christina told me what time it was Eastern Time. So 10 to 11:30 tomorrow Central Time, and adjust your calendars accordingly. Okay, thank you everyone, and have a nice night. Thanks, Cristina.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks,
for the
Luke.
conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Cristina.